Downtown is green and growing with more than 20 urban green spaces and world-class parks. Downtown is at the heart of a network of trails along Houston's most historic waterway, Buffalo Bayou. And now you can enjoy movies in these great parks with Movies Under the Stars in downtown at Market Square Park and Trebley Park twice a month. Find the full schedule at downtownhouston.org. Downtown Houston. Get energized and revived. Today on CityCast Houston, it's been 1 year since Mike Miles was appointed HISD superintendent by the TEA, sparking one of the biggest district overhauls in America. Many controversial changes were made, but what do they really mean for the future of HISD? Houston Landing's education reporter Asher Lehrer-Small is here to explain that and to tell us why so many local ISDs are facing a budget crisis. It's Tuesday, May 28th. I'm Raheel Ramzanali, and here's what Houston's talking about. Asher, welcome back in. How are you?
Doing pretty well. Thanks for having me here, Raheel.
It's been a busy last few months here for you. So before we start diving into the budget and everything that's going on HISD, we are at the 1 year mark of Mike Miles' first school year. How would you sum it up?
Yep, you're right. Things have been busy. End of the school year is a crunch. And at this 1 year mark, I think it's fair to say what we've seen so far, this is looking like the biggest overhaul, the biggest set of changes to any public school district anywhere in America right now. So you couldn't really understate what's going on here in Houston.
Yeah, it's such an undertaking and so much change is going on. How do you think Mike Miles is going to measure his first year in terms of success?
There's a lot of factors there. Of course, there are a lot of folks who have been following and taking their own measures. Folks have been watching teacher turnover, principal turnover. Those rates have been a little bit higher than in the past. But I think the superintendent and maybe the school board as well, are going to measure it based on how standardized tests go. So we've got those STAR tests are being taken this spring, and we're going to get data on them in the fall. Another thing that I'm looking at, and I think probably the administration will be looking at too, is like, what does HISD's enrollment do next year based on how folks experience the changes this year? Like, will more students come to the district? Will a bunch of families leave? HISD's been seeing falling enrollment for a number of years. And in some recent documents the district put out, they gave the baseline estimate for budgetary reasons that they would lose about 4,000 students, which is on par, but a little bit lower than they've been trending recently. So if they can stay within that 4,000 student loss, or even like flatter or gain students, that would be a big win for the district. We can also get more granular and see like our students and families going to the schools that have been overhauled. Are they leaving the schools that have been overhauled? And I think those are going to be pretty big factors in saying like, hey, so far, does this look like a success?
Wow. So there's a lot of data to dig through and figure out, because that sounds exhausting in terms of looking into every single point of, are people leaving? Are they going to the NES schools? Are they leaving NES schools? That's just going to be a lot of digging for you.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting. I mean, folks are taking this moment of like a year into the overhaul to be like, hey, how's it going? But really, the time where the rubber's going to hit the road will be in the fall, kind of like maybe sometime in October or November, when data starts to trickle in. And, that'll be like our Christmas as reporters, because we'll be able to, really see via the numbers of like, how is this going?
All right, into the first year, what are some positive things that came out of Mike Miles as superintendent?
Yeah, so I mean, of course, as a journalist, I can't say like what's good, what's bad, but what I can say is there are a lot of folks who are really excited about the fact that the superintendent was able to boost teacher pay really significantly at a lot of schools. So this current school year, there were teachers at 28 schools that saw increases in pay of, on average, like $10,000 to $20,000 a year, which is a lot of money. And I don't know of any other school district anywhere that has been able to do that as meaningfully. And next year, it's not just going to be at 28 schools, it's going to be at 130 schools, which is a really significant scale up. That's nearly half the district. So the teacher pay thing is really an important piece to watch. And then the other side of things, folks can say what they will about the changes themselves that have been made at the overhauled schools. And when I say overhauled, I'm talking about the schools in the new education system. People have a lot of different opinions on those changes. But the fact is that there is additional attention and funds going to schools that have needed that for a really long time. So a lot of people see that as a positive as well.
All right, let's get to the controversial side of things. And there's been a lot of controversy. There's been a lot of drama. What would be the most controversial thing that we'll remember from this first year?
Right. I mean, as you know, there's been a lot of talk about everything that's going on. It's been one of the biggest news items in the city. Really controversial, the changes. People probably know about, the librarians getting fired at many schools. They know recently several principal of the years were dismissed. But my personal take, I think like the heart of a lot of the controversy is in Superintendent Miles' understanding of what classroom instruction should look like and what schools should look like. So he has this picture of classrooms that include very frequent checks for understanding, very fast-paced lessons, and lessons that kind of follow along a somewhat standardized curriculum. He's open to individual teachers making changes to that, but it kind of starts from the same baseline. And I've been in these classrooms, and they do feel different. They're very fast-paced. Their teachers are asking students to engage a lot. It's hard to tell whether the students are always engaging meaningfully or whether they're doing it because their teacher said to do it. But not only is the superintendent saying, like, this is what education should look like, which is a controversial idea in itself because teachers are used to, closing that classroom door and teaching how they want to teach. But on top of that, he's really enforcing these methods, not just at the overhauled schools, but across the district by having much more frequent classroom observations from school administrators and from district officials. And so that's kind of communicating to teachers, this profession as you knew it is very different now. So, that we see that ripple out into folks who were beloved in their community, teachers and principals getting fired. We see that ripple out into perhaps some misunderstandings from administrators and kind of how strict they should be enforcing these methods and a lot of fear from educators. And so I think that has really changed the tune in the district. And the superintendent I've heard him say that he feels like some regret about the way he's communicated some of these changes. So maybe there's some that's gotten lost in translation, but to me, I think at the heart of a lot of this is the fact that across 270 schools, HISD is trying to change what education looks like.
And the way education is changing in the classroom, we actually got a good insight into it when you had a chance to guide a conversation and host this live event you did with Houston Landing and Superintendent Mike Miles featuring 4 high school seniors. First of all, how was hosting that? And then second, what were some of the big takeaways from this event, talking to actual students who have gone through the changes and went through that first year with Superintendent Mike Miles in the classroom?
Totally. Well, it was a really special event. The whole idea behind it was students are the most important constituents in what's happening. They're the ones who experience the changes in real time. Let's put the microphone in their hands and kind of allow them to lead the conversation because that doesn't get to happen too often. And for folks who want to, catch up on what we spoke about, there's a recording on YouTube. There's also a summary article on our site, the Houston Landing. But for me, I'm not going to pretend like I wasn't nervous beforehand because we're hosting a town hall style conversation. Like there's a lot of factors of, how that could go. We didn't know exactly what the conversation would look like. But what I have to say is the students really stepped up. They brought it. They did not hold back with their questions. And I felt that the superintendent really listened and gave thoughtful answers. There were several things that he said on stage that were new information to me. And, stepping back and kind of trying to take, stock of the whole event, a big takeaway for me was that lots of students, high schoolers especially, and really thinking about upperclassmen here, they have a bit of cognitive dissonance about the changes under the superintendent. So on one hand, they're like preparing for adulthood, preparing to go to college. And on the other hand, they're having to follow these really strict behavior standards that seem a little bit childish to them, like walking on a specific side of the hallway or carrying a traffic cone to the bathroom. There was one moment on stage where the superintendent said, actually, I'm sorry, that traffic cone policy should not have applied to you as a senior. That was wrong. And it wasn't meant for you as a high school senior. So that was interesting to me. Now, one big caveat about the event overall is that we featured older students in the event. We featured high school seniors. We did that by design because these are folks who are about to graduate. They won't have to face any repercussions for anything they could say on stage from HISD. But it's entirely possible that the reforms are playing out differently in elementary schools, in middle schools. And in fact, one of the panelists referenced his younger brother's experience, who I think he said is a rising fifth grader. And he said that the changes at his brother's school have really worked well for his brother, that his brother had a hard time learning for years and has seen his grades go way up. So, that may have gotten buried a little bit in some of the dialogue, but I think that was an important point as well. But the overall message for me was that like the students on stage, their experience, their lived experience has been that the changes they've seen this year have been much more behavioral than academic.
I was watching along, and one of my big takeaways, and you guys also wrote about this in the Houston Landing, was when Sterling High School senior Lorgie Martinez asked about the Ignite program being taken away. And the Ignite program is basically, it's a program that helps students with college applications and also the financial aid side of it, which is so important. What did Superintendent Mike Miles have to say about that program and college advising in general?
Yeah, it's a really important question. Lorgie talked about her experience with Ignite, and she said it changed her life. It allowed her to access some summer programs that kind of put her on the college path that she's thinking about. She accessed advising through this program that helped her kind of prepare for her college applications. And, she spoke from her perspective as a student from a low-income family who really needed this sort of assistance in order to access higher education. There are many other students like Lorgie in HISD, so it's a really pressing point. Now, the superintendent mentioned that these are one or some of many contracted services that the district uses or has spent money on, and that the district has spent, in his opinion, way too much money on contracted services, and that they need to cut down on that. Now, the greater context here is that HISD is in a really big budget crunch. There's a wide gap that needs to be filled, and there are big cuts that they need to make. And it sounds like, maybe some of these college access programs have borne the brunt of that. There's another similar program that's big in HISD and also in surrounding districts. It's called Emerge. And the superintendent mentioned that one as well. He said that current students in that program will not be affected, but the HISD is looking to kind of potentially replace some of its contract with Emerge through philanthropic dollars instead. So it sounds like that program is also a little bit in question. So it's something to keep watching.
Are they going to replace these programs? Any signs of that? Did he talk about that? Because as you mentioned, these are super important programs for a lot of students.
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that. I mean, it's as far as I know, it sounds like the Emerge program is remaining for now, and that there's plans to keep it going. But, some of these offerings kind of depend school by school.
I have one more question from that conversation. Vocational schools were brought up a lot during this event. What is Mike Miles's plan to incorporate more vocational programs in HISD?
Yeah, it's an important question. And kind of before I get into that, one thing that I will note there is that just in some of the response on social media I saw to the event, this was something that people kind of watched and took note of in the conversation, that when students were asking about programs like Ignite that help them access college, that the superintendent included in his responses a significant focus on CTE, or career and technical education, which is a little bit more vocational And I think their concern there was that, like, hey, we have students that are capable of going to top colleges. Is the answer for them preparing them for vocational training, which is typically moving toward a less prestigious post-secondary route? So I think that was a concern for folks. Again, we don't have answers around that. That's more of a question mark. But there was some new information to me that the superintendent shared at the event regarding vocational training. And that was that, as we know, HISD is considering going out for a multi-billion-dollar bond, presenting that to voters in November. And one thing it sounds like his administration is considering including in that is a big expansion of vocational centers throughout the district. So currently, HISD has Barbara Jordan Career Center, but it sounds like he's looking at having 3 vocational centers throughout the district. And these are, of course, centers to train students in things like welding, automotive repairs, culinary arts, and all sorts of other professions. So that's something to watch as well.
Sign up to The Economist for in-depth curated expert analysis of world events and topics ranging from business and culture to science and technology. You'll get the weekly digital edition, online-only articles, curated newsletters on politics, the markets, science, culture, and China, and full access to The Economist Podcast Plus. The Economist is independent journalism for independent thinking. Go to economist.com and get your first month free.
This episode is brought to you by Shopify. Whether you're selling a little or a lot, Shopify helps you do your thing, however you cha-ching. From the launch your online shop stage, all the way to the we just hit 1 million orders stage. No matter what stage you're in, Shopify's there to help you grow. Sign up for a $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/special offer, all lowercase. That's shopify.com/special offer.
All right, you brought up the bond package, but lost in that storm that rolled through a couple of weeks ago was the fact that Mike Miles unveiled the new budget, and it kind of got lost in the news, right? So can you break down what exactly was unveiled in next year's budget?
Right. I mean, yeah, there can't be too much attention put toward the money because that is really an important thing to follow. And we did get some new details in the budget. What the superintendent said is there is a $528 million gap that the district needs to span in order to balance the budget. My understanding of the documents they released was that that gap would be bigger, except that the district is planning to sell $80 million in properties, and they're also planning to dip $100 million into their reserve rainy day funding. So there is a wide gap that needs to be spanned, and the majority of those cuts, the administration has indicated, are going to come from central office. Now, that can be a little bit hard to conceptualize as for like a layperson, like what does a cut to central office mean? Previously, we reported that more than 100 wraparound specialists were losing their jobs for the coming year. So these are folks that are stationed in schools and respond to students who maybe have like poverty related needs. So perhaps they don't have enough food or need clean clothing. And these are really important specialists who allow students to not have to be as bogged down by the out of school needs so that when they're in school, they can focus on learning. Now, when I originally reported that story, I was told there were around 170 folks on the call that was notifying folks of their termination. At the event that we hosted with the superintendent, he actually said a little bit more there. He said there will be 50 wraparound specialists remaining. And if we kind of take that number by deduction, that would mean around 200, 220 or so specialists are being cut. Now, to put that in perspective with these budget cuts, that probably saves the district $10, $15 million in salaries. And we're talking about $500 million that needs to be spanned here. They're talking about cutting over $400 million of that from central office. So you can do the math. That's 30, 40 times as many cuts as what we've heard through wraparound. At the event, Superintendent Miles also mentioned a number that I had not heard before, which is about 1,400 positions from central office being cut. So you can get lost in the numbers. They're really big, but the idea is that there's a lot of layoffs that are coming.
I'm speechless right now because that gap is so big, and all the cuts that you mentioned, is that going to close the gap? Bring it near? Because according to y'all's reporting, some departments will see cuts up to 88% of their budget from this past school year. So with all these cuts, how are these departments expected to do their jobs with such a reduction? Because next year is still going to happen.
Yeah, I'm sure it will be a big challenge for the folks in central office. Now, a bit of context on those numbers. An 88% cut sounds like a ton, is a really big number. The reason those budgets have been so high, according to the documents that the district released, is that for years, HISD has been propping up its budget with COVID relief dollars. So there was a pandemic stimulus package that got sent to schools across the country. And HISD, I'm pretty sure, got over $1 billion from that. I think the number is $1.2 billion. And this fall is when those funds expire. So what the superintendent has said is that over the last several years, HISD has been losing students, bleeding enrollment, but instead of making the budget cuts to make those numbers sustainable with the lost enrollment, they've been propping up their budget with these added funds from the federal government. So he's saying that now when those funds expire is where the rubber hits the road. So these 88% cuts, a lot of that are these short-term funds that were previously making the department's budgets a lot higher than they would have been otherwise. It is still a drastic cut, and it's something that I'm sure will be very difficult for those folks in central office, but that's a little bit of context on why those numbers are as high and severe as they are.
Gotcha. And yeah, we're going to talk a little bit more about that COVID relief package that a lot of districts have gotten. But before we get to that, I'm curious, you talked about the salaries being great for a lot of teachers in HISD. We had Mike Miles on in September, and I asked him about this as well, about NES teachers making close to $80,000. That would be the best in our area right now. How much of those high salaries are ballooning this budget?
Well, you're right that, paying teachers more is expensive. And the superintendent has said, you pay for the things you prioritize. And he has really made this a priority. There's about 11,000 teachers in HISD, and about half, roughly, at the 130 schools that are being overhauled next year are going to see these elevated salaries of in the 80s and some teachers even in the 90s. So, we're talking about $10,000, $20,000 raises for thousands of teachers. That's in the tens of millions of dollars. Even teachers that are not at overhauled schools are seeing a pay bump. That largely has to do with the fact that the school year is getting longer next year. So they are working more days. They have to get paid a little bit more. So all of this contributes to the budgetary strain. But the superintendent has been clear that paying teachers is a priority of his. And so the idea there, obviously, I think not only is teaching hard work and they deserve a high wage, but also to attract top talent to the district, and especially to attract top talent to schools that have been historically underserved.
Okay, so some non-NES campuses have to cut their budgets up to 12%, and there have been cuts to custodians and the wraparound services, as you've already talked about. But Mike Miles says he's going to keep cuts away from students. Do you think he's going to honor that promise? Have you gotten any indication that he wouldn't?
I mean, it's hard to speak to that directly, but what I can say is that there are a lot of people that have concerns about some of the cuts he's already announced, including the cuts to wraparound, because these are positions that directly support students, especially the students who are the most vulnerable. Now, technically, considering payroll, they're under central office, so those are not considered campus cuts, but these positions have operated and functioned at the campuses. And now the superintendent has said that they're going to be a level above, operating at the kind of district or regional level, which changes things for students. So there are people who are concerned that promise to keep cuts away from students is, being bent a little bit.
All right, you mentioned this bond that could potentially raise billions of dollars for upgrades to school campuses, incorporate more vocational programs, but some community advocates are already saying that they won't support the bond. How do you see this all playing out over the summer and going into the fall? Is there support for this bond?
The bond question, I mean, it's the multi-billion dollar question,
Yeah.
right? Like, we're talking so much money. It may be one of the biggest that Texas has ever seen because it has been a really long time since HISD has seen a bond pass. The last one was in 2012, so more than a decade ago. And that was serving primarily high schools. So when we look at what elementary, middle schools, how long it's been since they've seen repairs, it's been much more than a decade. There are elementary and middle schools that are built more than 100 years ago. And one of the focuses of my reporting has been, in the summer, how many schools were having AC issues? In the winter, when we saw that freeze, how many schools had heating issues? It's a large share of the district. So this sort of thing is really needed, but you're right. There's been this rallying cry, no trust, no bond. And there are a lot of people who say they don't trust Miles's administration to be responsible stewards of such a big bond package. What I can say is that HISD is already behind the eight ball in terms of timing and chronology of getting this bond proposition to the public. There hasn't been any details released publicly yet. And I think they're going to have an uphill battle to make sure that they win people's trust. At the same time, I will say that I've seen survey results that I believe surveyed a couple thousand HISD residents, and there was support for a bond as long as it didn't raise property taxes by a large amount. Now, those margins, it's kind of a question of, is 2,000 a representative sample? Some would say that it is. We also hear from folks at public comment during school board meetings. Many of them are kind of against the idea of putting this much money in the administration's hands. So it's hard to gauge exactly how the community stands, but it's an important point for the ongoing health of the facilities in the district. So we're going to have to watch that one.
And one more layer to add on top of this is that this is a state takeover, right? And all of these changes that are going to be put into place, the potential bond, the budget cuts, what happens to all of those for the next administration when the state takeover ends, whenever that is, because we don't have an exact date of that as well. So there's long-term implications here. And this is just absolutely wild, Asher.
No, that's such a good point because, passing a bond is one thing, but then actually carrying it out, figuring out where exactly you're going to invest, making those investments, getting those contractors, building whatever sort of infrastructure changes you need to make, that's a years-long process. And as you said, we don't know when the transition back to an elected board of managers or elected board will be. There's some wiggle room there in the directions that the state has laid out thus far. So it could be the sort of thing that if this bond does pass and they embark on this project, that is the sort of thing that they'll have to carry over during the handoff back to elected members.
It's been a wild year. There's been a lot of drama. Will things finally calm down? Do you think it's going to be a little bit smoother as we transition into year 2 for Mike Miles?
Look, I'm praying for it. My sleep schedule is praying for it. No, I think that I will knock on wood and say this year probably included the most whiplash of any of the upcoming years, just because of how new everything was, how quickly the changes progressed. They spanned 85 schools in 1 year. And so I think there was a lot of whiplash involved in that. But, that said, HISD has a way of keeping us on our toes, and there's never a dull week. So I'm not going to jinx myself there. I'm not going to speak on that one.
Well, if HISD doesn't give you enough drama, there's a lot of drama regarding budget crisis around the area when it comes to other ISDs as well. And you've mentioned the COVID relief package that is going to be expiring not only for HISD, but for a lot of ISDs. And it seems like a lot of school districts right now are dealing with an upcoming budget crisis. How did it get this bad, and what long-lasting impacts do you think we'll see from this upcoming crisis?
It's such an important question because it's not just HISD. It's many of the districts in the area and across the state and even across the country. Now, specifically in Texas, there are some overlapping factors that make what's going on really tough. The first, as you mentioned, is the end of COVID relief money. Now, this was a blessing to schools. They got tons and tons of money at a time when they really needed it during COVID. The problem is that a lot of them invested it in ways that didn't necessarily lead to financial sustainability. So if you get a chunk of one-time money and you spend it on an expense that is recurring, like a staff salary who you don't plan to eliminate after the funding goes away, then you're set up for a budget crisis. A lot of districts have done variations along that. So that's already a problem. Feeding that problem is the fact that Texas as a state has not increased its basic allotment per pupil to school districts. So the amount of money that school districts are getting per student that they serve since 2019. And now we all know that if you go to the grocery store, prices are not what they were in 2019. So that makes it really difficult for districts because they're having the same amount of funds essentially to pay for things that are more expensive. So that's also exacerbating the budget issue. There are a lot of school districts that were really hoping that the legislature this past session would have bumped up that allotment, especially given that they had a really big surplus. So that's something that a lot of school districts are watching and I think really, really praying for to happen in 2025 in the next legislative session. Because what we're seeing right now is they have to prepare for the assumption that they won't get any extra money. They're announcing big budget cuts. It's extremely painful to students, to communities, to families. So I think a lot of districts across the state are really looking to the legislature to give them just a little bit of relief by increasing that allotment.
Is that the only solution on the horizon right now?
It's one of the biggest things to watch. I mean, each district has its own budgetary questions to answer. Many have efficiencies they can make. School districts are really big organizational units, especially the large urban ones. So, as Superintendent Miles here in HISD says, there are efficiencies to be made. He said you have to look under the hood and kind of change the wiring. And so that's kind of also a solution that districts have, but there's a limited amount of efficiencies you can make. You can only make that up to a point. And really what it often ends up meaning is layoffs, which, hurt children.
Asher, thank you so much for joining us. That was very informative, and I know it's going to be a very busy summer for you as well, but we'd love to have you back on.
Yeah, thanks, Raheel. Always good to talk with you. Hope you have a great rest of the day, week, and enjoy the summer.
Yeah, I'll try. Thanks, Asher. That was Asher Lehrer-Small. You can read all his work with the link in our show notes. And while you're in the show notes, you'll see a link to our annual listener survey. Do me a favor and take it, please. It's only 7 minutes long, and you'll be entered to win a $250 Visa gift card and some CityCast Houston swag. You can take it at citycast.fm/survey. And if you took it last year, I appreciate that, but I'd be even more grateful if you could take it again since we can't use last year's data anymore. Once again, that link is citycast.fm/survey, or just look in the show notes. That will do it for today. Thank you for listening, and I hope you learned something new. And, just lay it out for or something. So can you break down what exactly what was